DNA of the soul.
Welcome, I'm your host Kenny, and you're listening to Social Sleuth. You know the drill, we're back to yap. Joining us today to unpack these questions is Aidan Walker, a writer, content creator, and internet culture researcher. I found his work on Substack and knew I wanted to pick his brain. We go a bit outside of Aidan's area of expertise to talk about censorship and algorithms, but this guy memes, and I think there is a lot to take away from this conversation.
Drum roll, please. Can anybody guess?
Welcome, Aidan. Thank you for coming on to Social Sleuth. I really appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
Yeah. Did you want to give yourself any introduction, tell people what you're up to?
Right on, yeah. So I'm Aidan Walker. I'm a content creator and writer about internet culture. I do a bit of reporting, and I yap on TikTok about memes and platforms and what internet culture can tell us sort of about our history and our current moment. And I also write a Substack called How to Do Things with Memes.
Perfect. Definitely go check that out. That's how I found you, was on Substack. And then kind of what I've trying to do with all the episodes is, how do you define a meme? Well, definitions I don't think are perfect, but if you could define it, how would you go about that?
So that's a tough question for sure, and I'm certain that across episodes we'll get a lot of different answers. For me, the first definition is the Richard Dawkins one, that says meme is a form of imitation, and it's set up on this analogy that culture can work the way biology works. I think that that's kind of a flawed analogy and hypothesis for a few different reasons. But the biggest one is that it was invented in the 70s, and so the things that we call memes, didn't really exist. And then also the Dawkins meme can kind of apply to everything. So, if everything is a meme, then what does it mean? To say that there's something specific going on with internet, with the images, image macros, videos, copy pastas, whatever format. And so in 2014, you have the Schiffman definition that is in memes and digital culture. Might be 2013. My recall isn't perfect, but mid-early 2010s, Schiffman, great lady, comes out with this definition that sort of looks at memes as a class of digital objects that share certain qualities of, I think, content, form, and stance. And that definition I like because it recognizes that there's both kind of a meme singular, which would be like, an individual Wojak JPEG or something. But then the Wojak meme as a sort of format refers to a group of digital objects. It has to be online. And then you're paying attention to this stuff around content, form, and stance. And that, for me, differentiates meme from, a poem, from a song, from, a painting. And in the Dawkins definition, meme is any bit of cultural, information that gets replicated and thrown around. And I've fooled around with it and thought a lot about it. I don't think I'm necessarily the person to write the final definition of meme, but the one that works for me that I think of is I add on top of the Schiffman one that generally you have a format where there's one thing that always stays constant. So like an image macro memes, like say a distracted boyfriend, it's the same image every time. And then one thing that changes. So like an image macro is distracted boyfriend, it'll be the text that changes. And I think roughly thinking of it that way, you have one piece that's constant, one piece that it's like a math formula almost, you might have
one piece is being manipulated, but you can still see the original piece there.
Yeah, like you have a line and you have the y-intercept. I was horrible at math in school, but that's like
Me too.
Like y equals mx plus b or something, and so you have a constant and you have a variable, and that's sort of how I see them. And I think that definition is good because it allows you to say, okay, an image macro has that structure, but kind of so does a TikTok dance. It might be the same audio, the same choreography, but then the variable is the person doing it or the context they're doing it in. And so I like to see it that way. And any new meme that I'm writing about or thinking about, I like to think, okay, what is the constant part? What is the variable part?
Absolutely. I like that. Thank you for sharing. I had been more familiar with the Dawkins, and like you said, it's so vague and it kind of encompasses everything. So it's hard to define it. So that's awesome. Thank you. And I guess kind of the other follow-up of routine questions on this podcast would be, what side of the internet are you on when you're recreationally on the web? Where do you find yourself?
It's changing, I'd say my beginning journey as a terminally online person, I definitely first kind of loved Instagram memes and sort of those surreal ones. I was on Reddit, I think just like talk about topics. I wasn't deep into dank memes or anything like that. And then I truly got addicted to Twitter, pre-Elon, and was very much like, capital D discourse. I just enjoyed that. There would be a main character. I love that like sort of group frenzy that you're on Twitter and you feel like you sort of have your own section of Twitter where your own interests. And I was following sort of political stuff, and then I was following a lot of kind of, I guess I'd say like literary theory Twitter. I don't know if that's good, but it would, like English professors that shitpost was kind of the side that I loved. Kate Kaju is my favorite one of those. And then I got on TikTok about like a year or two ago, and I got really into that. And it's weird that for me, the internet is not quite recreational because I worked for Know Your Meme for 2.5 years. And so it really changed my relationship to it, that I always log on now and I'm like, okay, which meme is popping off and which would be good to write about, or now which would be good to make a TikTok about. So it sort of altered my perspective on that.
Blurred those lines.
Yeah. Yeah, but now I think I'm a TikTok cell, for sure. I'm out there scrolling constantly. I still go on Twitter, and I'm more and more on Blue Sky. I think Blue Sky has the juice, for sure.
Yeah, I haven't been on Blue Sky myself, but I remember hearing whispers about it when I was still in my sociology program from professors. So it's nice to see that it's sort of blossomed and there's getting some more attention there.
Yeah, it's starting to hit like enough people are on it that it sort of is fresh, and it still feels very like the average age is 35. So it's not quite as, I don't know, Twitter had always like a rancid feel that I kind of liked. Like it felt like a dirty place even before Elon bought it. Blue Sky feels a little more like people are like, oh,
one might say.
Yeah, a little more sophisticated, a little more shirt tucked in, a little more like, here's pictures of my dogs, let's be positive,
That's cute. Very wholesome. That's awesome. I guess, so I have my notes on the side. That's where I keep looking.
Of course, yeah.
I guess to follow up, some big buzz about brain rot and it being the Oxford word of 2024. And I believe I'm quoting you. I took some notes and some were comments from other people, but it was brain rot is media without motive. I want to say that was from something that you had written, and I just wonder what you think of that being the word of 2024. It's sort of jumping out of this mainstream internet culture and being taken over by, I guess, like an institution and taken that way.
Yeah, the brain rot is media without a motive thing. I thought of that and I felt like it was like a good slogan type thing for sort of what I believe about brain rot. Because the thing about brain rot is that, of course, it's surreal, of course, it's nonsensical. And I felt like it was sort of wanting people to say, what is this? Why would somebody ever make this? That feeling. And then also like with a lot of internet culture where it's like, okay, I know what mewing means, not everybody does. I'm sort of special for being able to interpret this to the extent that it exists. And so I'm not sure how true brain rot is media without a motive is, even though I'm the one who said it as a slogan and thought it would like sound good in a TikTok video. But the kernel that I was trying to get at there is because you have that reaction of, what is this? Why would somebody ever make this? I think that's refreshing because we're so used to reading internet content by sort of why someone would make it. When we read the intention of that person and sort of our imagination of them, as much as we're reading the piece of content in front of us. And I think that comes across even in sort of the names we have for different kinds of internet content. So like a thirst trap, is interpreted as, okay, this person is trying to, seduce me or, stroke their ego or whatever it is. Or, you think of like a think piece, this person's trying to contemplate something. Like when you sort of have that sort of between us and the thing we're reading or meeting online, or we're like, oh, this is slop, made by an AI to boost engagement, or this is an advertisement, and that line between what's an ad and what's not is already so blurry that it feels like brain rot kind of comes out of, left field on that, out of a secret third way or something. And it's, you wonder, why would somebody ever make this? Which most things on the internet, we think we know exactly why somebody would make it. And we're kind of, tired of feeling as if people are trying to sell us something or convince us or, kind of use our attention somehow. And so that's what I liked about brain rot. And the Oxford Word of the Year thing, I love that the dictionaries do this now. I think one year it was goblin mode, might not have been Oxford, but like they recognize the internet. They know that people are using it, and then they also know that it becomes a little media event. Because how often do you hear about dictionaries and what they're
Absolutely. Yeah, they're a little part of the show. I think what makes me laugh about it so much too is that I feel like a lot of people, myself included, were acting as if this is something new. And then I think back to my earlier days on the internet and even on YouTube and things like Annoying Orange or Fred. I don't know if you're familiar with. I think that was sort of my generation's brain rot, and now we're sort of putting these new words on it and acting like it's something really refreshing. And maybe that's because in 2012 and 2013, everything was still random and there wasn't as much clear motive behind it. And that was, I think, maybe 15 or 16-year-old kids making that content. And now it's a lot more streamlined and business and capitalist focus. But it makes me laugh every time as if, this is something older folks are saying is new for the young kids. And it's kind of been there
100%.
for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, we had the brain rot for sure. I mean, what else? Annoying Orange, you're right. Like, and it's beautiful, and in a way it is. I think there's a lot of things in the world that have existed before somebody named them. And then part of the reason why the name sticks around is that everybody is like, oh, hey, this finally, this thing I've always experienced but never like labeled now has a label, and people love that.
It's fun.
Yeah.
Okay, a bit of a bigger sort of question, but not really a question, more of a topic, would be surveillance. It's something that I've looked into like sociologically, and I think the world on the internet, at least the part that I'm seeing, is starting to talk about it a bit more, whether that's surveillance capitalism or more government down. We see like TikTok's coming down, and that would be an international government. I don't know enough about it to talk too much more in depth about exactly what that means, but please share what do you think of these algorithms and censorship and all these big topics?
Yeah, massive topics and good question. I think that my core thesis about it, I guess, would sort of be that, it's not normal what's happening. It's not, I mean, everything in history echoes. I totally believe that, time is a flat circle or whatever. But the way that these companies are gathering power, it feels weird to think of them as companies. Apple selling phones is not like Ford selling cars. Instagram, doing content moderation is not like the New York Times, kind of controlling what people think and say by being the paper of record. There's something novel and new and powerful going on. And it's a kind of power that I think is playing and sitting weird with sort of the current structures of running the world. And you look at things like, regardless of sort of where people fall politically, something about, Elon Musk, being essentially the vice president of the US, and he's a tech mogul, and he kind of did it through his social media platform in a way to support Trump, or even things, around the world, like sort of alt media and sort of Poilievre and Jordan Peterson sitting down. Like, there's something weird going on, both that leaders can kind of go around the traditional institutional structures that run things and sort of find this new route, but also that kind of the moguls and people running that new route, like Zuckerberg and Musk and Bezos, have this sort of power that is fundamentally undemocratic. And I say that not so much to insult it, although I kind of hate those guys, but also just to say, yeah, it's because they own the most money and the most shares. Nobody voted for them. It's fundamentally undemocratic just by fact. And that's all because of surveillance capitalism, as people like Shoshana Zuboff and different scholars have talked about, that the power, this new novel kind of power, comes from being able to watch us, record data about what we do, using an algorithm to gather that data and then interpret it. And then by knowing so much about what we do, create these monopolistic platforms where, it's where we date, it's where we find jobs, it's, where we have culture, write memes, write takes, where we get news, where we make our money, buy things. Everything runs through one of these platforms, and they're powerful because of the data collection. But then that data collection, B sort of is able to anticipate, if not kind of condition what we do next, kind of set the bounds of possibility. So like if you're running a business on Amazon or an app on the App Store, you have to follow their rules as you're running it. But then the thing you can start has to fit the sort of the channel that they've drawn for you to go down.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's always been true of power. I mean, that is what power is. But I think now they can draw the channels in new ways, maybe. And that's what I think is, in a way, like the actual reason to study memes, is that they're a way to, by watching how they spread and watching what they express, you kind of learn more about how this stuff works. That's my hope, at least. I'm not sure if I've done it concretely, but the surveillance capitalism is, it's a process.
It's moving so fast and it's dynamic. It's hard to sort of catch up to it and really pin it down. I think you're on the right track. I think you're definitely doing that when I'm reading some of your pieces, thinking about things that maybe I've thought about in one context and then taking it over to memes or the internet more generally.
Yeah. And what is sort of the sociology take on surveillance? What was your
surveillance,
sense?
Again, with the power and this idea of sort of socially sorting through a lot of these ways and how that can be related back to more political motives. And then if we see that, well, maybe the governmental entities aren't looking directly through surveillance at individuals, but using these sort of back ends through media companies and pressuring of media companies. And I'm in Canada as well. If that sort of changes, we have a lot different laws and sort of public perception on, I think, that censorship conversation with new bills and our media laws to make sure that journalists are being paid adequately is sort of what's going on with that. And then, of course, that comes with a whole slew of other sort of regulations that maybe aren't directly related to that. And then I know in the UK, like hate speech sort of laws around that, and then persecuting people. So I think it's kind of interesting. Obviously, there's laws that govern people when they're walking down the sidewalk. And so it's kind of interesting to see the application online where the motive is blurred or those sorts of things are different. So that's where I'm concerned about it. It's not, and I like that a lot of people say, well, I have nothing to hide, and that sort of approach to it. But it doesn't take away that this data is still being used to govern people, even if it's just by like the platforms itself, by Zuckerberg or Elon or whoever is making those changes. So I get worried when people say that, well, I have nothing to hide, but if things are constantly changing and shifting. Sorry, I went off. And I see.
I totally agree. Yeah.
The Luigi memes and sort of your comment of this undemocratic sorting. And I sort of wonder to what degree you see it as permissible disobedience. I think because you talked about it, it's disturbing a dominant dialogue, which I think is really great to see. And it's good to see like this social movement of people feeling empowered to talk about things and to go against the grain. But then, like I said, to what degree is that an allowed disobedience if we know that all of these sort of conventions are in place, and maybe that's too deep. But
do you sort of mean like to what degree is it like the platforms have allowed us to, post about Luigi, and so it's sort of a controlled.
And is that to see what people are saying, or is that to allow this sort of dialogue to go one way?
Yeah, that's interesting. They could hypothetically do something, like they could censor the word Luigi or something, like, they do in China. People will be talking about something and then you shut it down. They definitely have the technology to do that. I guess I'm not an expert on their tech stack or whatever, but it feels like Meta has done that and could do that. But they chose not to in this case. And I hadn't really thought about it in the terms you brought it up. That's true. Is it allowed? Is it permitted? One thing I'd add to sort of what I was saying earlier about the companies and the algorithms determining the channels and power is there's a side of it that does start to sound like, oh, there's this conspiracy of, now dripped out Mark Zuckerberg talking to whoever, running the world. And on one level, that is true. They have all this power. They do all this stuff. But the other thing about the platforms is that we're ungovernable. Like we're posting crazy, BS all the time, and even if they were to, like they do in China, censor a certain word, people find a way around that. And so at the same time, as this sort of concentration of power becomes a threat to people and a threat to democracy, I do think that resistance is never entirely tamped down. They haven't figured that out yet. They haven't figured out how to keep people from protesting and agitating. Maybe they'll get better at it in the coming years, and that's horrible to think about. But if the Luigi thing is allowed, that's interesting to sort of speculate what their motives are. I would say it could be one of two reasons. Like, one, they just don't feel like they're, strong enough to maybe tamp down on that, or they feel like that would be too much of a breach of norms or whatever, to the extent they're still governed by that. And then two, I do think that because this is sort of a new form of power, I don't think Amazon and Meta feel like they have anything in common with a big insurance company. Even though they're all capitalists and they're all so wealthy, I don't know if they care that much about, or I think in general they might share a kind of ambient hating the establishment thing that posters online share too. And I think you see this in Luigi himself, like leftists and anarchists were posting like, oh, he could be one of us. And it's like, no, he was like a self-improvement kind of politically incoherent person, it seems, based off his online footprint and so on. And so, yeah, I think you're right. It could be permitted in that, I bet Zuck doesn't think health insurance is a well-run industry. Not that he would ever have to worry about getting a medical debt or something, but, to the extent he cares about it, I'm sure he sort of lightly is like, oh, yeah, maybe that is stupid, that people die because of this in the U.S. and every other developed country is socialist, or to some degree, I don't know what's going on.
That brings up to even just a perspective of seeing this even just across the border, not that far away, is that that bit of context of the healthcare is lost. At least for myself, I can't speak for all Canadians, but that's not a problem that we live with. That's not a problem that I think about when I walk outside. So I see it from a different perspective, less about exactly what it was an event about, but more of the statement that it says and the anti-capitalist sort of statement behind it. So it's even just interesting hearing somebody that's living in that sort of ecosystem versus outside of it.
The class warfare kind of thing. I mean, it's top of mind for me because I recently, got a new health insurance policy, and as you just are reminded of the bizarreness of that. In addition to the cruelty of it, just like, being like, so what's the difference between a copay and co-insurance? And like, I remember at one point I was working essentially as an au pair in France, and I took the kid I was taking care of to the dentist. And being an American, I was like trying to explain to the receptionist, being like, hey, so I'm not his parent, but, here's my ID, here's my visa, what paperwork do we need to fill out? Like, here's his ID. And she was just like, you just swipe the card that the government gives you. And it's just, what? Like, that's it. And so I feel like, the tech bros, to the extent they're rationalist and logical, are not defenders of the American health system.
No.
Yeah.
It's wild. I guess another thing, sort of this surveillance and algorithms, would be if you're on TikTok. I don't know if you've seen, this is a very new thing. I think I saw it yesterday on TikTok myself, but about comments being viewed differently on different people's devices. It was one woman was going through the comments and had showed it to her partner or sent it to her partner, and they had brought up the comments. She's like, look at them, see, they're like picking her side or whatever it was. And it was actually the opposite.
Yeah.
It was one of those like, oh, partner red flag. And then he was like, oh, but all these people are agreeing that this guy wasn't in the wrong and all of these different things, and sort of pitting each side against each other. I don't know if you've seen that video.
Was it the one where he was like out golfing and then like didn't?
I think so.
Like tell her or something?
Hadn't communicated anything.
And then it was kind of like if, the girl that saw it originally was getting all these comments taking the girl's side, presumably because like Instagram or TikTok or whatever knew that she was a woman, and so they're like, let's give it that perspective. And then her boyfriend pulled up the same thing, and it was like man, she's like, inhibiting his freedom or whatever. Or not that term. I
Let
don't
men
know
have
if they said,
fun, that
yeah.
sort of thing.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah, women are always, yada, yada, yada. Yeah, I think that's so illustrative of like what we've been talking about with these sort of channels that, I'm not going to hide the fact that I'm a man, right? But like if I go online and then that content is being tailored to me as a man, and I'm only ever seeing that perspective, and I'm only ever seeing the version of man that, TikTok or people as a whole or the company wants me to see as something to model myself off of, then sort of my freedom to be, it's weird using gender as the example, but being like a different kind of man is sort of curtailed, or that by the fact that they've seen me and they've seen what I'm interested in, I'm going to get served all these ads for, like wanting to lift weights or like take supplements or like, survivalist stuff. And, what if I wanted to be into other things, like, and to some extent, that's power is eternal. Boys and girls have always been socialized a certain way, kind of prevented from, gender roles doing their own thing. But when you have an algorithm and the platform behind it, I think that's going to look different and maybe be even more severe. And so it's like, I don't have anything to hide, yeah, but, no one's ever watched us this
Prescribing you
close. Yeah, it's
that
prescribing,
sort of
yeah.
identity in a way. Whether you buy into it or not, it's still there and
Yeah,
it's still being constantly pushed at you. And you don't really have any, like you said, an idea that something else exists.
yeah. Or even it could be like, thinking back to that example, I'm not sure that it was golf exactly, but if it was golf, one component of my identity is that I'm a man. Another component of it is that personally, I think golf is stupid and boring. And so, if TikTok wants me to choose, being on the man side over hating golf, then it's kind of, because I think naturally in that situation, I would empathize with the girlfriend because it's stupid to go and
Let's
golf for
go.
5 hours. Like I'm with her, but if the comments section is making me be with him, then it's a
I think of it too as to get away even from like the gender, but even just age demographics and how that plays into it. If I look at my Instagram versus my mom's Instagram, even though we like a lot of the same things, it's probably going to be tailored to her in a different way and maybe push different things. Or you see the Facebook mom groups and being pushed conspiracies and the WhatsApp for chemtrails. And it seems like different things for different people. When it's all laid out in front of you, it's hard not to sort of wonder those things.
or it's the classic kind of radicalization rabbit hole of like you think oh, maybe seed oils are unhealthy for you, and then the algorithm's like, okay, you're not into seed oils, what do you think about vaccines? And then you sort of start to get like down that path, and so many people do, and it's tragic. And in that case, I think there might be some amount of evil intent on the part of the algorithms that, if they turn you, one way to get someone to be addicted to your product is to make them radically into some conspiracy theory and think, you're the only place that they can find truth. But then I think that's another example too. Resistance might not be the right word, but human users and people using these platforms to do what they want to do, and get what they want out of it. Because the conspiracy people are so entrepreneurial and they're, running influence operations. And I think also you could run in the opposite direction, sort of against conspiracy. You could use the platform for that. And so that's one example too, I think, of where, the platform is very powerful and is constraining people's choices, but it's not entire. People are still making choices. It's just being amplified differently or different. There's a different
And I can
settlement.
put my phone down and walk away and go outside and live in the real world and be away from those choices. But at the same time, how you said before, we're working online, we're dating online, we're doing
Yeah.
everything online. School is online a lot of the time. Sure, not on social media platforms, but it's so ingrained and it's almost a trade-off of you have to buy in to a certain degree in
Yeah.
order to participate. And maybe that's
Yeah.
a very sort of living in an urban center perspective as well. Can
Exactly.
change
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And I mean, in a way, it's also, even back in the old days, I think like this is maybe a stupid take, but I think of like urbanization, like in the 1800s or something. I'm like, you're one of several peasants, you've lived out here forever and ever. Going to the city is a bit like signing up for social media, that suddenly you're in this place with a whole bunch of other people and you feel the state or you feel central authority like in your life a lot more, and you're being watched a lot more, and you have, in a way, many opportunities to meet new people, do new kinds of work, sell new kinds of things, but you're doing it within someone else's maze. And I'm sure that country living was not necessarily free, but if you're just out on land and no one's watching you, and every year or so the feudal lord comes by to collect the tax, you kind of, in the day-to-day, you're much more autonomous, and you're much more kind of governed by your small local community rather than by some bigger network.
So that's a great analogy.
I always like to think, you ever seen those like small Victorian child posts?
Yes.
It's like, if you showed this to us, they'd die. You show it to like one of
Absolutely.
the children from the coal mines in 1874, they'd like show them a brain rot video, their head would explode. And I always like to think of the internet. I keep one of the voices in my head is the 1870s small Victorian child, and I'm like, what would she think of this? What does it look like to that kind of world where you have transformations that did happen, like the Industrial Revolution or urbanization or the formation of states, and how does this compare, I guess?
Sorry, my brain went off. I always think of the Dew Dogs or the Mountain Dew hot dogs and that sort of format every time. I can't avoid it.
Yeah.
Okay, where am I at on this list? Oh, I had sort of thinking about when you're talking in your distracted boyfriend meme about these sort of layers and this idea of perception, and how the platform plays into that reading of it, or the consumption of the meme, where the like buttons are, where the comments are, even the user's handle and those sorts of things, and how cross-posting content, if that has any sort of impact or it distorts that meaning, and maybe that doesn't mean anything, maybe it's important, but if you have an expectation for one sort of medium and then you're viewing it on another platform, have you thought about how that could work in a way?
Yeah. So that whole cluster of ideas that I have about the layering of the image, and how you see it sort of like you're looking at a distracted boyfriend meme. And like I was saying at the beginning, there's the constant part and the variable part, the picture and then the text. And you could see that as two different layers or two different screens. The first screen being the screen of the camera or the screen of the stock photo platform where that picture was posted. And then the second screen being somebody else's screen where they, copy and paste it in that text. And then the third screen on top of that is your screen where you're looking at it. But then with almost all memes, you have this layering of even further screens. So if it is a cross post, then you have the photograph, the text on top, the screen on top of somebody looking at it, that person reposts it. And so then on your screen, you're looking at their screen, looking at the meme screen, looking at the photographer's screen. And so you have these layers that build up, and it kind of works through this depth structure. And I think in a way it's even more visible with stuff like quote tweets, where you'll have, the first tweet embedded inside of another tweet, and then people will quote tweet a quote tweet, or they'll screenshot a quote tweet and throw it on Instagram. And I think kind of by reflex, part of how we read digital images and memes is by going through these layers. And that sort of connects to what I was saying about reading someone else's intention first and then reading the thing second. And that's so much of the data that we're getting when we're looking at a meme, I think as sort of a knee-jerk reflex response, we're like, okay, this is a screenshot of a tweet that was a quote tweet of a tweet, and you have an idea of every person at each of those layers, the possessor of each of those screens. And each of those sort of layers is its own context too, right? So there's a speaker and an audience. I'm reposting something, I'm me, I have an idea of who I'm posting it for. And then the third party sitting there has an idea of me and an idea of my audience. There's a certain time, so Distracted Boyfriend was the photos from 2017. Well, okay, the photos from 2015, I think. The meme got viral in 2017. Reposts could be made in 2019. my screenshot of a repost made in 2022, and now my analysis of my screenshot of the repost of the 2017 meme based off the 2015 photo is in 2025. And so there's a different time to each. And then, in a sense, there's also a different space, like the photos from Spain, the person tweeting about it. At one point in my research, I kind of traced it back and talked about the very first distracted boyfriend meme that was the youth, looking at socialism as the woman in red, capitalism as the girlfriend. It seems like it was a German language poster, and then one of the first big reposts was an Egyptian language poster, and so that's also different spaces and different geographies. And so when you're looking at a meme, you're sort of looking at this, like, I don't know if I want to say like a baklava, that's the wrong metaphor, maybe a shish kebab, or a layers. I say layers, maybe like, I thought of a lot of different words for what I want to mean, or like sediments almost, or strata, like where you dig into the earth and you have, the dinosaur bones are at a certain layer, and on top of it is the clay and then the topsoil where you plant. And you have that story, and a lot of the information that we're picking up is in that story and that movement between different contexts. And then the last part of that, for me, that I've been thinking about a lot is sort of how power moves through that. Meaning that the topmost screen, which is, kind of always the viewer, you can choose to like or dislike a meme, comment on it, share it, repost. So we have a certain kind of power. But then also inside of that layered structure, it's not just the things that we're able to see ourselves, the meme, but the meme is also like the metadata file that Twitter is looking at and saying, okay, 50 people liked this in the course of 20 minutes, therefore I'm going to recommend it to the cluster of accounts that have interacted with memes and these other accounts in the past, and that too is what we're seeing. And that's one layer of, kind of in between each of these human screen layers, there's a little layer of whatever technical AI robot thing is looking at this image too. And so that shish kebab is, the same way you might have chicken, onion, pepper, different things. You have, TikTok algorithm, random shit poster, Twitter algorithm, Reddit post, the weird Reddit admin community of whatever niche meme subreddit that was on. And then at the very bottom, you have, Antonio Guillem, stock photographer, who's taking the photo to fit with the algorithm of Getty Images as the platform and how that works. So that was a bit of a ramble, but
No, that was awesome.
Yeah,
They're
that's
all
sort of
these
how I
different
think of
platforms,
the.
and it's one more layer, one more piece of the kebab on top. I was thinking,
Yeah.
that
Is
makes
the
a lot of
kebab
sense.
image good, or could it be more like a club sandwich?
Maybe
Where
a club sandwich, yeah.
yeah,
You have your foundation, the things that you would expect on there, and then maybe you add some extra sauce that throws it off a
yeah,
little bit.
yeah.
Yeah.
Everything's a sauce, or is a club sandwich the? I guess this is off topic, but like your classic sandwich, it's like bread, something bread. But a club is like bread, something bread, something bread. There's like an intermediate
Oh, true. Yeah, there's three
bread.
layers of bread. So the
Yeah.
original
And so
stock
if you,
image, the
yeah,
viral meme, and then the reposting.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. And each becomes its own whatever. And I think a lot of those layers are also, as you're sitting there scrolling, you don't have to be aware of all of them to be affected by them. Yeah.
Absolutely. I guess it kind of makes me think of another topic I talked with my friend on my first episode was about this idea of irony and how that sort of, or this post-ironic world that some people are claiming that we're sort of living in, where we don't know what's real and what's fake and what's supposed to be funny and what's supposed to be news. And to kind of layer back into the algorithms or censorship, do you think that I don't know if we have the perfect way to execute it, but is there merit in looking to censor certain things online? Like, where do you sort of stand on whether that be hate speech or negative things that would otherwise be collectively probably seen as bad? If we could do
Yeah.
it in a good way, what would you think of that?
Yeah. I mean, that's in a way the biggest, I'm not going to say biggest policy question of our times, because there's like climate change and war and stuff, but how to administer and govern these spaces, is such an important consideration. And I would say that it is a question of governance. It's a balance that you're going to have to constantly be negotiating. And I do think it is appropriate to do stuff like, the basic level everybody would agree on is, censor CSAM, like, content that, is illegal because it's, sexualizing children, or like, that's the base level. And then death threats might be the next thing on top that some fringe people would disagree with. And then on top of that, like misinformation, slurs, conspiracy theories. And where I'd kind of, I'd say that if I were running a social media platform, I'd have sort of rigid, hard rules around definitely, censoring certain types of words, certain types of narratives. But I am interested in, even though I hate X and Twitter, and I hate what Meta's doing with peeling back content moderation, some kind of community notes type thing, where you give some of that authority to sort of determine the shape of the discourse, what is permissible, what is dangerous or what is not to the people and to the users. And I think we often have this approach to content moderation where it's like, oh, it's just cops for the internet. But I think it has to be more and deeper than that. Not necessarily like they should be able to put people in cyber jail, if you post something that's bad, but to the extent that we're citizens of these places, and we should have certain responsibilities. We should have skin in the game. And there should be, I think consequences for doing stuff like there is in real life. And I think too that people need to have responsibility, or be given some amount of responsibility or authority over what their space looks like. And so I do think that if I were running a platform, I guess the short answer is that I would, want some kind of democratic process. Maybe you could even elect content moderators. I'm riffing now. I know nothing about this subject ultimately. But like you'd need some balance. And I think it is ethically correct and necessary. Because the deeper question that I've never thought that much about is like, what is speech? In a sense, like in the US, they decided that corporate donations to politicians counted as free speech in like 2007 in a Supreme Court case. And that, that's not speech, but then, is what the algorithm does is that speech. If it decides, okay, someone's, saying X viewpoint, I'm not censoring them, but I'm just not gonna, allow it to spread. Is that act a speech act done by the corporation or whatever? And I don't know.
Yeah, it's a hard one. It definitely wasn't an easy question to ask you. I don't expect any perfect answer. I think we'd have probably way less problems going on. Yeah, it's interesting. I know that, and I think what I would say is a less serious topic, at least in Canada, where cannabis is legal federally, and we have content creators that, or even local businesses or dispensaries that can't post content onto Instagram or other meta-based platforms without it being taken down. But these larger corporations and American-based corporations that are working out of Canada are able to post quite explicit content of people actually consuming product versus just, here's our cool shop and these are the people that work here. That sort of content is taken down for Canadian businesses and content creators versus celebrities and these bigger organizations are able to put it all over the internet. So it's just kind of interesting how we see it playing out with something that is legal in one place and then illegal where I guess the shots are being called.
Yeah. And that raises sort of, I think another facet of it. What you're saying is that part of content moderation, they aren't just the cops of the internet, like stopping people from doing bad things. It's also like an active intervention to level the playing field, that if a big international business, if there's a different set of rules for them than for the little guy, then, something about the platform needs to change. And I think seeing content moderation in that broader thing of how do we make these spaces safer, but also fairer, and, how do we make them sort of defend people and keep them, I think is a question that nobody's really asked, who has power. They want to see content moderation. Yeah, it's just like we're going to prevent bad actors, but it's like, no, content moderation is a broader, it's governance. How are you going to structure this thing so that it has, outcomes that are good for people?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's just a big, big world. I'm always thinking different parts of it. Try to reel myself in a bit. And then this probably was part of the more introductory part when we were talking, and maybe part of the definition, but memes being the signature cultural product of our time. And I believe I'm quoting you as well. Tell me if I'm wrong. And just where you see memes going. Like, throughout this conversation, there's obviously so many things at play. There's different platforms. The platforms are changing. Will anybody buy TikTok? We don't know. Do you think you have some job stability in talking about memes?
Yeah, hopefully there's people continue to post. Yeah, it's impossible to predict the future, but the two things that I think will happen that will change meme culture medium term, if not long term, are something like Roblox, where the platform no longer is seen sort of as here's a place where we're posting and doing things and it's social. I think we're going to see more gamification, especially with younger people. That it'll be like a massive online role playing game. Maybe TikTok and Instagram already are that to some extent. But if you look at the way Roblox works, and IKEA hired real people to staff its Roblox shop, and it's sort of this massive platform where there's little mini games inside, and it has its own currency. And I think we're going to see social media that looks a bit more like that, where it kind of grows out of a game.
I'm completely unfamiliar with the platform. I'll have to check it out.
So I'm pretty unfamiliar because I'm not 10 years old too. But
yeah, fair. Interesting to think about. Yeah, the gamification, just another way to get more people hooked.
Yeah, and then the second thing is like VR or something. I think if that sort of comes to maturity, that'll change memes. And one way to look at it is a little bit of sort of by hardware and how it works. So like early net art, you have desktops and it's very fixed. It's very not that immersive in a way. And then you have laptops, which are more portable. And then you have phones, which, are pretty immersive because you're with it all the time. It's kind of always augmenting your reality if you're doing everything through your phone. And it's a much more intimate relationship to the computer than like when you have to walk over to the desk where the computer lives. With the phone, the computer, goes with you into the bathroom and stuff. So it's a whole other kind of thing and more opportunities to get data. And then early phone apps, like Twitter and Instagram, I think are very built for like the 2010s smartphone experience. There's less you can do with that. And then you have a platform like TikTok where now the internet and 5G or whatever the heck is able to better allow for there to be constant streaming video. And it's even more immersive, and it's even more, I think, about the body in a way than about looking at things. That the first big thing about TikTok is dances. And I think in the Chinese market, one thing that's interesting is those apps, I think, use the gestures of the phone a lot more. So, like, there's a thing, one of these Chinese apps, one of my friends was using it, that you can shake the phone and it, like, reshuffles the feed, And so sort of using that a bit more, and I think you sort of see that turning into sort of VR, AR kind of hardware or headsets or whatever, where you're now controlling it by the way you move or the way you whatever. And so I wonder if memes, by kind of that definition I said, like one constant part, one variable part, whether a meme might look like the constant part is a gesture and then the variable part is what you say or something. I think that it's going to jump into kind of that new medium of simulated space, perhaps.
It's crazy to think about. I'm going to have to look into Roblox and pretend I'm a 10-year-old again.
Yeah, I mean, I know kids in my life and stuff that, showed me Roblox and what they do, or there's like, you see it filter over onto TikTok to the extent that, the youth are on the talk. And there's stuff like, kids like doing a pose from Roblox in one of the in-games, like at school as a challenge, or like, cases of children like extorting and bullying one another for like Robux, like the in-game currency and stuff. And I don't know if you like played Club Penguin or RuneScape or any of those, like for our generation,
and Webkins and those sorts of things.
Yeah, but Roblox is a whole other beast. It's so much larger. And I think, it's so much more about chat, and then kind of in the sense a lot of Twitch streams are too, just kind of being in a space, hanging out with people in the game, in the virtual world. And I think that's if I were to bet on the future of social media, it would be something growing out of a game.
Okay. I might have said this the last question. This is the last one. Sort of in your definition of, you're stepping away from Dawkins' definition, and I forgot the name, sorry, of the second definition that you were pulling from.
Schiffman, Lamar Schiffman.
Thank you. What about the piece of like this viralness that I think, at least in the Dawkins, is sort of like a hallmark of the meme itself? So I was kind of thinking, will the meme survive if algorithms are sort of bubbling people and there is no viralness anymore, if it's all just really niche sorts of things?
Yeah, that's the part I like about the Dawkins one, actually, is it gets into this sense of memes, which for him are sort of these cultural ideas. He has the sense that they sort of replicate independently of the people who author them or make them. And that they're sort of these forces in the world that, we're not always in control of what we're saying. Most of the words I use, I learned from someone else. And, these things have been going for hundreds of years. And I'm, in a way, just a carrier for whatever virus that I'm spreading to you as I'm talking to you or whoever's listening to this. It's like I'm sneezing on them with my brain or something, or when you post a meme, you do that too. And so I like that kind of virality. I think in some ways it doesn't quite hold up as a metaphor. I mean, no metaphor totally works 100%. What you're saying about algorithms getting more bubbled and maybe it's not as possible for something to irrationally spread and hop around. I think to some extent that's always been true, and that, it isn't like a perfect free market for ideas that we're, living in here. And if it gets more bubbled, it would be certainly different kinds of memes, less big ones, probably different aesthetically. And that's a really good point that I don't really have an answer for about what it looks like if viral spread stops being a thing, which I think is very much a possibility for the internet. But the example I think of is there's this book, Traffic, by Ben Smith, who was the editor of BuzzFeed. Well, it's political editor during the peak BuzzFeed era. And he talks about the dress, the blue and black or white and gold thing. Mm-hmm. And because BuzzFeed had a very close relationship to Facebook at the time, because BuzzFeed's traffic, it all came from people posting the articles to Facebook, they had sort of an inside line to Adam Mosseri, who now is the head of Instagram, I think. But at the time, he was just, working on Facebook. And BuzzFeed posted the dress, and that was like their most viral article ever. It went everywhere. Facebook saw the data. It all went through. It was a crazy event for the internet. And Ben Smith says that internally at BuzzFeed, they were overjoyed. They're like, we've had such a success. It's amazing. Facebook, who we sort of partner with because they're how we disseminate, they must be really excited too. But then they went and they talked to Adam Mosseri and they talked to Facebook, and Facebook was horrified by the dress. They were scared that something, pretty harmless, had gone that viral, and they couldn't control it. They couldn't, it's just overwhelming. It was something, I don't know the number, but it was an insane amount of traffic on Facebook was about this one thing. And the way Ben Smith describes it, he says, Facebook never allowed something like that to happen again. Nothing has ever gone viral the way the dress did. BuzzFeed never had a banger of that magnitude again. And I'm sure there's stuff people would love to talk about to the same degree they talk about the dress. But the fact that that went so viral and it scared Facebook, and then they sort of tweaked the algorithm or did whatever to prevent something from taking over the conversation in that way, I think goes to show that threat you're talking about, that the internet could get bubbled to the extent that virality is tamped down. I bet we've already seen that to some extent. I bet that, if Meta or Facebook had done nothing, we would have constantly had dress. And that would have been a problem in its own right. We would have just been led by the swarm to weird directions. But yeah, I don't know. I always think of that anecdote. If you want to look it up in Traffic, it's one of that Facebook was terrified that they just saw this thing spread like that. Yeah.
That's pretty neat. Yeah, definitely something I think about, as if if we've already gone through that, or if it's coming, even with just sort of, I guess in the last few months when I've really been paying attention, or maybe in the past year, of just the types of suggested posts and how frequently I'm getting them on my own just personal Instagram. And it's definitely much more curated, I would think.
Yeah, which I think goes back to the content moderation point too, in that, you want some amount of curation going on. But you don't want, constant top-down control.
I love all the memes. They're great. But
Yeah.
I know that they're not what everyone else is seeing. That almost brings us to an hour. I don't know if you had any final thoughts or anything you'd like to share with my audience.
No, I think I'm all good. I'll just say if you want to see more of my content or my essays and stuff, I'm going to be posting on YouTube after TikTok ends, because I'm American, as is evident. I may be affected by that ban. So it'll be Aidan, etc. over there, and then how to do things with memes on Substack.
Awesome. Well,
thank you so much, Kenzie, for having me.
Wow, what a convo. A refreshing perspective from outside of the hypercritical soci-doom and gloom. I encourage you to check out How to Do Things with Memes, and while you're there, you can read my Substack posts at KennyC402. Thank you for listening to Social Sleuth. Keep sleuthing.